Infinitum, exceso de velocidad.
Este momento tan especial, porque es un verdadero honor encontrarnos reunidos en este auditorio, en nuestra sala principal, que es la Juan Rulfo, rodeados de este público apasionado por la lectura, por el pensamiento, y pues celebramos la presencia que hemos estado realmente pues paladeando, hemos estado buscando y tenemos la fortuna el día de hoy de tener a la escritora nigeriana Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie en nuestra ciudad. Un hecho que nos llena de orgullo porque obviamente sabemos la calidad de su obra, todo lo que nos ha entregado con sus distintos libros, Chimamanda, desde aquella americana, esa novela maravillosa, que por cierto fue un libro que leí de manera completamente casual, que me conmovió, y a partir de ahí abrí los ojos a una literatura que desconocía, que es la de Chimamanda. Por supuesto, luego con el Todos deberíamos ser feministas, y hoy también viene a hablar de su más reciente publicación. Pues tras su primera visita a la FIL en el programa Los Continentes de la Palabra, Chimamanda regresa con la potencia de quien construye con palabras un puente hacia la empatía y la dignidad. En tiempos en los que las polarizaciones parecen multiplicarse, cuando las certezas absolutas ciegan y el miedo a lo distinto amenaza con sofocar el diálogo, su voz surge como un bálsamo. Su palabra nos recuerda la urgencia de escuchar, de entender, de abrirnos a la diversidad de experiencias que nos hacen humanos. Así que les pido que abramos bien los oídos y el corazón, y por supuesto le doy las gracias a todo el equipo de Penguin Random House que ha hecho posible la presencia de Chimamanda esta tarde. Disfrutemos de esta conversación, de esta plática que nos dará ella, y celebremos la literatura, la reflexión, la posibilidad de transformar la mirada. Los dejo con Chimamanda Ngozi. Gracias a todos.
Hello. Hola. Thank you. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for that very warm welcome. Thank you for the kind introduction. It's very nice to be here. So I was here in Guadalajara, I think almost 20 years ago. And I've been to Mexico a few times since then, but not back to Guadalajara, so it's nice to be back here. But in thinking about what to say today in this presentation, I, of course, thought about the last time I was here, but also I thought about what happened. And I gave a TED Talk called The Danger of a Single Story, which has, much to my delight and surprise, become really well known everywhere. And I'm just, I continue to be very surprised and moved by how many people talk about it, tell me about it, teach it in their classes. And of course, Guadalajara plays a role in this TED Talk. And so I thought that I would start this presentation by reading the part of the TED Talk that concerns Guadalajara. But I must quickly add that I too am just as guilty on the question of the single story. A few years ago, I visited Mexico from the US. The political climate in the US at the time was tense, and there were debates about immigration. As often happens in America, immigration became synonymous with Mexicans. There were endless stories of Mexicans as people who were sneaking into the country, being arrested at the border, fleecing the healthcare system, that sort of thing. I remember walking around Guadalajara on my first day there, admiring the architecture, watching the people at the market, people going to walk, people smoking, laughing. I remember first feeling slight surprise, and then I was overwhelmed with shame. I realized that I had been so immersed in the media coverage of Mexicans that they had become one thing in my mind: the abject immigrant. I had bought into the single story of Mexicans, and I could not have been more ashamed of myself. This is how to create a single story. Show a people as one thing over and over again, as only one thing, and that is what they become. So I want to just say thank you to Guadalajara for teaching me about my own single story. And and I think I was ashamed of myself, but I also think that being ashamed of oneself can be an opportunity for change. And it was a learning moment for me because as a Nigerian, as an African, I'm very used to talking about the single stories that other people have about Africa, and there are many. Right? There's always the stereotype of Africa as a place of poverty, as a place of violence, and when I left Nigeria and went to the US, people would often ask me questions that just shocked me by the ignorance and by the narrowness of it. But it took my coming to Mexico to realize that I also have single stories of places, and that I think it's important for all of us collectively to be a bit more inward. It's one thing to be critical of what other people are doing. I think it's as important to look inward and think about what you're doing as well. So I want to talk about stories. Stories have been the bedrock of my life. I have been writing since I was old enough to spell, and when I'm asked when I knew that I wanted to be a writer, my answer, the most honest answer is, I don't know, because I don't know a time when I did not want to be a writer. Stories have always been really the center of my life, the thing that gives me meaning. I have this memory from my childhood. I was about maybe 9 or 10, and I was sitting in the backseat of my mother's car, and we were driving from the university campus where I grew up, and we were driving to the market in town. And so the campus where I grew up was very quiet, very slow, a really lovely, safe place. We had streets and avenues, and the hedges were always very beautifully cut, and the campus felt like a world on its own. And in a way it was. You know, we had our own churches, we had the primary school that was for the staff of the university, we had a swimming pool and basketball courts, and we had a huge generator. And so often when the electricity was cut off, which happened quite often, the university generator would come on. So we were, in some ways, there was a privilege in living on campus where you didn't really experience the more negative aspects of life. And so anyway, on this day, I'm in the backseat of my mother's car, and we're driving to the market. And I'm looking out of the window, and when we drive outside of the campus, suddenly the town just sort of this gentle chaos of people and motorcycles and cars and hawkers and noise in that most human way. And I remember looking at all of that and suddenly feeling this intense pang of melancholy. And I realized that my melancholy was because I realized that what I was looking at were stories. So many stories. And I realized that I would not be able to tell them all. And so for me, stories have shaped me, stories have moved me, stories have informed me. And so I want to talk about stories. I want to also maybe sort of frame it by saying, there's a wonderful quote from James Baldwin, which I love, and it is, "For while the tale of how we suffer and how we are delighted and how we may triumph is never new, it must always be heard." I think all stories have been told, but as human beings, we keep telling them. We bring something new to each retelling. We bring a new nuance, a new detail, a new cultural perspective. But I think all human stories have been told, but we have to keep telling them. In Nigeria, Nigerians are very good at what I call the art of complaining. We complain about everything. And so in a gathering of Nigerians, what's going to end up happening is everyone will start complaining. And we should complain. So mostly we complain about the terrible government, we complain about the roads, and we complain about education and healthcare. But I've also noticed that when somebody who is not a Nigerian says exactly the same things that we say about Nigeria, Nigerians get very upset. I'm one of those people. So if a foreigner, so sometimes I'll read something where a foreigner has said, oh, Nigerian corruption is terrible. And I'll get very upset. But then maybe just the day before, I was telling my friends, Nigerian corruption is terrible. And I've always found that curious and interesting, and I've thought about that. And I think the reason is that as Nigerians, we know that we do not have a single story of Nigeria. We know that we are, of course, aware of the corruption and all of the negative things, but we also know about the ingenuity. We know that Nigeria is not just a place of negatives. And I think the reason we get upset is because we think that the foreigner does not know that Nigeria has other things going on, that it's not just about the corruption. And so that's why we get upset. I think that this says something in a larger way about us human beings, that we want to be seen, not just in the small slices of who we are, but in the fullness of who we are. We don't want, as the Nigerians talking about Nigeria, we want to know that you have the full context and that you know that, that a country or a person is not just a single thing. I think that literature helps us see and also helps us be seen. When we read stories, we become alive in bodies that are not our own. It is not so much that you become someone else, but in an act of radical imagination, you see the world as they see it, even if briefly, even if only fleetingly. We cannot measure our humanity, but literature can help us recognize it in ourselves and in others. Our humanity is that glowing center in all of us, perhaps most of us actually. It is what makes us speak up about an injustice, even if that injustice does not concern us personally. It is what makes us aware that we are better off if our fellow human beings are better off. It is what reminds us that we are not just bones and flesh. We are emotional beings. And all of us share a desire to be valued. All of us share a desire to matter. So I grew up on a university campus in southeastern Nigeria. My father was a professor, my mother was a university administrator, and I was raised Roman Catholic. And like any other Catholic child, I attended catechism classes. I was always curious. I always asked questions about everything, and that did not always end well. Anyway, one day, we were taught about the Holy Trinity, that there were three persons in one God, that the three were different but equal, and all three made one God. I was confused. It made no sense. And yet I found something beautiful at the heart of the idea of the Holy Trinity. It said something sublime about equality, about the possibility of unity in diversity, that three very different, very distinct persons could be equal as one God. For me, the Holy Trinity can be read as a metaphor for the possibility of a truly just and diverse world. In one country, multiple identities cannot merely exist, but they can exist equally. A person can have multiple identities and does not have to choose which is more important. All the identities can matter equally. In today's political climate in different parts of the world, it is common to hear people be very dismissive of the importance of identity. In the US, the expression identity politics is never used in a positive sense. Yes, it is true that in some cases, some unrealistic political arguments are made in support of identity, but the truth is that identity matters. We are made up of our individual stories. Our identity is an integral part of our story, of our history. The universal question that literature asks is, what does it mean to be a human being? I believe that what is most important to human beings is love. Love in all of its myriad forms, to love and to be loved, to have a sense of meaning in your life, to feel valued, to matter. So this is a universal desire that we have. We seek meaning in whatever form. And at the center of that seeking is love. Identity matters because it shapes how we go about this universal human desire. Consider, for example, the story of a woman in New York City who goes in to interview for her dream job. She's qualified, and this job will give her a sense of fulfillment and a sense of meaning. And then the man who interviews her, the boss, just ignores her qualifications and grabs and groups her. Her identity has become an obstruction in her path to her universal human need. And so identity matters. Consider other examples. A white man from a lower class who is qualified but denied an opportunity because he does not have the right accent. A black woman denied access because her natural hair, the hair that God gave her, is considered unprofessional. A lesbian denied an opportunity because she's told she's not a good cultural fit. These are all stories I know of personally, stories about people I know. And there are so many such stories. Identity shapes the way that we look at the world, and more importantly, identity shapes the way the world looks at us. So here's a story from my childhood. I remember a woman who was a professor. When I was growing up, there weren't many women professors, so this woman stood out for being one of the two women on campus who were full professors. So this woman was often spoken about in very disparaging terms. People said she was arrogant. As soon as her name came up, somebody would say, arrogant. I knew this woman, and I thought she behaved in exactly the same way as many of the male professors. But these male professors were never really called arrogant. People instead said they were confident. The behavior was the same. The only difference was identity. In this case, biological sex. And because of her identity, almost everyone in the university, both men and women, judged her negatively. This continues to happen all over the world today, to women in public life, especially women in positions of political or economic power, and women who are not reluctant to use their voice and not reluctant to occupy space. And so for the same behavior, a man is considered confident while a woman is called arrogant. Or a man is assertive while a woman is aggressive. Or a man is strategic while a woman is manipulative. Or a man is a leader and a woman is controlling. Or a man is authoritative and a woman is annoying. This realization about the female professor helped me better understand the nuances of identity. That sometimes the negative effects of identity are not dramatic or loud. It is not merely about being called names or epithets. It is also the small judgments and the small assumptions and the small stereotypes that are attached to your identity. And they might seem small, but the effect is not small. These judgments can reduce your opportunities in life. They can shrink your spirit and your soul. I began to imagine how this female professor might have thrived without these unfair judgments. I imagined, for example, the many people who would not vote for her to become head of department because she was said to be arrogant. But those same people would readily vote for a male professor who behaved exactly as she did. And even more tragic was the realization that these people who judged her so negatively did not necessarily do it out of malice or out of evil intentions, but because of the stereotypes and expectations attached to women, ideas so often repeated throughout human history that they have become normal and ordinary, often unquestioned and even unseen. So we repeat these things and we don't even know that we're repeating them. I often wonder how much we have lost as a human civilization because women were so often excluded. What art might we have produced? What diseases might we have cured? What new technology might we have benefited from? In a country with many identities, the most important question to ask is, who is visible? Who is invisible? Whose story is mainstream and whose story is at the margins? Who has political power? Because we must admit that even that political power is linked to identity and linked to stories. And so in a country like Mexico, where I know that there are multiple identities, I think it's a really interesting question to ask, whose story is told and whose story remains at the margins. When Barack Obama first became the president of the United States, there was much crying among his supporters. Even those who did not support him spoke of the importance of his election. Why? Simply because of his identity. Because people who looked like Barack Obama had for centuries been deliberately excluded from political power. America had for centuries given its citizens who looked like Barack Obama a message. That message came from America's legal system, from America's social institutions, and that message was, you cannot learn to read, you cannot vote, you must not dare to dream, and you do not matter. And so the tears shed by many at his election, tears of joy, and tears that came from the memory of injustice, and the tears that came from the memory of ancestral pain, was an acknowledgement of how much power and identity are intertwined. If your story is told, it makes you visible. If your story is told, it gives you dignity. In this diverse, multifaceted world that we live in, stories really matter, especially for those who are not at the center. Fuller stories, storytelling that starts not with ideology, but simply with truth and humanity. But I think it is important to say that the stories of the people who are in need, stories of people who are in the margins, stories of the people who are excluded, people in the minority, cannot be only about their need. Those stories must also be about what they love, what they resent, what wounds their pride, what they aspire to, what makes them laugh. Today, the language increasingly used about migrants in the US and in Europe is horrendous. It's the language of criminality. And we forget that the history of humanity on Earth is a history of movement. And we forget that but for the random good fortune of birth, anyone could be a migrant in need. In September, the American vice president made the false claim that Haitian immigrants were eating their neighbors' pets, their cats and dogs. He later claimed that such stories were necessary so that the media pays attention to the suffering of the American people. Now, it's not clear to me how spreading lies makes people pay attention to the suffering of the American people. But it is clear that in those words were a casual contempt for the dignity of his fellow Americans, and that he was practicing that depraved trick of scapegoating, looking for somebody to blame so that you can deflect from the real issues at hand. For many Americans, the words of the president and the vice president about Haitians might be the only story they will ever hear about Haitians. And the stories we hear of people shapes how we see them, how we think about them. And so today, there are now millions of people for whom Haitians are people who eat cats and dogs. Stories matter. When I was growing up, I read books from everywhere and books about everything. And it was reading that made me believe in the universality of human experience. And so, for example, when I read the classic Russian writers, I did not always understand every small detail, but I always understood the human story. the human motivation. And I also learned that there is a kind of universal welcome in literature. Literature is open to everyone. And this brings to mind a quote by the great African-American intellectual, W.E.B. Du Bois, who once wrote, "I sit with Shakespeare and he winces not." Through literature, we learn of that important idea that there are roads out of antiquity that do not lead to the Renaissance, that human history is not merely Western history, that it is imperative we preserve the importance of language and keep the meaning of words. David Grossman wrote about Kafka's story, a little fable, and in that fable, the mouse says, as the trap closes in, and the cat is coming closer, the mouse says, "Alas, the world is growing smaller every day." Language gets smaller when we abandon literature, and the world gets smaller. And I cannot help but think of social media and the squeezing and squashing of language and the reduction of original thought, so that it seems to me that certain words have lost all meaning because they're so overused. Words like toxic and trauma. I like to think of literature as my religion. Reading may not always make us more empathetic, but it can. I'm not always successful at empathy, but it is literature that makes me want to keep trying. By far, the greatest lesson I have learned is how we are more alike than not. That we may show love differently, but we all love. That what matters to us may differ, but we all want to matter. That it is as important to extend grace as it is to expect grace. And that dignity is always as important as food. And in conclusion, I recently read about visitors who had gone out to outer space. And I should say that I'm not a fan of tourism in outer space, but this struck me. I think we should focus on our bloody Earth and fix the problems here before we sort of start heading up to outer space. But I did find it moving when some people who'd been to outer space wrote about the scattering of light over the surface of the Earth at nighttime. And it made me think of a poem by an American poet called Alicia Ostrika. She was born in Brooklyn in 1937. And so I would like to quote a small section from a poem. This poem, it's called August Morning, Upper Broadway. Let us call this scene a window looking out, not at a paradise, but as a paradise might be if we had eyes to see. And so while I do not encourage tourism to outer space, and I personally would never go if I was offered, I do think that there is something almost transcendental and humbling to be reminded there is so much we do not know of our own existence. And yet, here on Earth, in this scattering of light, in the embrace of literature, in the recognition of multiple stories, we can be beside one another, muddling along, imperfect, trying, striving, but always together. Thank you.
Hola, muy buenas tardes a todos. Muchísimas gracias por estar aquí. Gracias. Thank you, Chimamanda, for being here with us and for that amazing, powerful, and wonderful speech. Thank you so much. Vamos a empezar a hacer una sesión de preguntas y respuestas. Vamos a abrir el micrófono para ustedes, así que si tienen alguna pregunta que quieran ir preparando, y vamos a hacer una dinámica en la que vamos a leer preguntas que nuestros lectores y seguidores de las redes sociales de la editorial Penguin Random House nos enviaron previamente, y con alguna pregunta que ustedes quieran hacer con base en el maravilloso discurso que acaba de dar Chimamanda. Así que voy a leer en español, ella tiene su traductor simultáneo. Y bueno, quisiera empezar con una pregunta que nos envió Sandra García con relación al tema de tu presencia aquí en México y cómo percibes a nuestro país y la emoción que te puede traer estar acá con nosotros en la Feria Internacional del Libro de Guadalajara. Sandra García dice: México la recibe como una autora profundamente influyente para nuevas generaciones de lectoras feministas. ¿Qué le emociona o le intriga de encontrarse con lectoras y lectores latinoamericanos que también viven tensiones entre tradición, género, clase y migración?
Okay. I think I just want to say something about, I think part of the question referred to me as a feminist writer. And I just wanted to address that first. Is the person who asked the question here? No? Okay. I have been a feminist for, I think I've been a feminist since I was old enough to think. But I did not know what that word feminism was. What I did know was that I had observed enough of my world, and I had read, and I had asked questions, and I had watched, and I had listened, and I knew that the world did not extend to women the same grace that it extended to men. And so I did not know that word feminist until I was a teenager, and I was arguing with a friend of mine, and he said, "You're a feminist." And he did not mean that as a compliment, of course. And even at the time, I wasn't quite sure what the word meant. So I just kept arguing, and I thought I'll go back home and I'll look it up. Because, of course, I wasn't going to let him know that I didn't know what the word meant. And I looked it up, and I thought, yes, that's exactly what I am. Right? I'm a person who believes that women are equally human and that women should not be excluded on the basis of being women. And so the lenses with which I look at the world, yes, is one of feminism. And I think that for me, feminism is a way of dreaming. It's a way of dreaming of a better world. And it's really about justice. But at the same time, I do not think of myself, and I do not like to be called, a feminist writer. I think of myself as a writer who is also a feminist. And the reason I don't like to be thought of as a feminist writer is because I think that literature really is above all kinds of ideology. And to be called a feminist writer suggests an expectation of a kind of ideological correctness. And I see this sometimes in students who read my work because they've come to my work thinking feminist writer. And then they'll say things like, oh, that this part of the novel doesn't abide with feminist principle. I'm thinking, yeah, who cares? Because the point is that literature, and I think all art, should never be ideologically correct. Because life is not ideologically correct. In some ways, I think, if life were ideologically correct, then we wouldn't need ideology, right? And so I think of myself as a writer and a feminist. I think that sometimes both have connections. I think that my work, of course, deals with women and women's issues, and that one can make a case for sort of feminist elements in my work, but to label my literature as feminist, for me, is something that I'm not enthusiastic about. So clear that up. Now I've forgotten the rest of the question.
¿Alguien quisiera preguntarle algo a Chimamanda? Por favor, allá adelante.
Oh, I think I remember now. I do have to answer. It was about how I feel about being here at the book fair. Oh, no, I'm very happy to be here at the book fair. I don't speak Spanish, don't understand Spanish. I mean, I understand maybe 3 things. But I do take the Spanish reading audience very seriously. And my Spanish language readers matter very much to me. No, this is true. Yeah. And so knowing that this is the biggest book fair for the Spanish-speaking world, I think is wonderful, and I love that it's in Mexico. But also, I've been to other Spanish-speaking countries, and I just feel a kind of, I don't know whether it's, apart from Spain, of course, I don't know whether it is that mutuality of having a similar history of colonization. I don't know why I feel so at home in these places, but it must be, right? We kind of, and yes, so I'm really happy to be here. Book fairs, and again, I just think that literature is so essential, especially now that it feels to me that we don't value books enough in the world. We're not reading as much as we used to, as sort of as a human race, and I think that we are losing out massively because of that. And so anything that celebrates the written word, to me, is wonderful. Just wonderful. And can I just quickly say, I know people are listening to audiobooks now, but can you also just bloody read them? I'm sure.
I love it. Ok, adelante. ¿Tenemos micrófono para el público, por favor? Para que pueda escuchar.
Bueno, gracias. Esta pregunta tiene que ver con el vestido que traes puesto hoy, el precioso color orange que traes, y considerando que el mundo cada vez es más gris, en nuestra ropa, en nuestras casas, por dentro, por fuera, estamos perdiendo color. ¿Qué importancia tiene el color para ti en tu vida y en tu literatura?
Excellent question.
I love that question. We need color, don't we? I mean, I think especially now, these are such dark times. I've been reading a lot about Germany in the 1930s because I feel that I want to understand what it was like, 1938, 1937, what it was like to, encounter a very new, strange form of authoritarianism and how people, and it's fascinating to see that people, much as we're doing now, people said, oh, it's such dark times, but then people didn't think that catastrophe was coming, I think it's really dark times, and so we need even more color. But also, in general, I'm Nigerian, I'm a West African. Color is what we do. And for us, it's really not remarkable. And I did not even think that it was remarkable until I went to the US, where sometimes I would wear something from home and people would be like, oh my God, that is so bright. And I would think, really? Because that's what everyone wears where I come from. So, but also I think that for a person who, I think that for people who are dark-skinned and darker-skinned, for black and brown people, color is very flattering. Right? I sometimes think that the colors that fashion tells us are universal or neutral are not necessarily so for darker-skinned people. So I'm all for color. And I mean, black has its uses, but sometimes just walk away from the damn black. Yeah. Sometimes don't be safe. Sometimes embrace. I just think life is short. Let's do color.
Por allá atrás tenemos otra pregunta, por favor. We have another question.
Gracias, Chimamanda. Yo no voy a hacer una pregunta tan colorida, me encantaría, pero me encantaría escuchar tú qué piensas sobre la posibilidad de que ahora en el mundo entero, sobre todo en las democracias occidentales, cada diferencia se convierte lamentablemente en una semilla o en gasolina para la chimenea de la polarización y del odio entre todos los seres humanos. Yo creo que tú eres una de las escritoras más ampliamente humanistas que hay sobre la faz de la tierra hoy en día, y me encantaría escuchar tu pensamiento Y si tienes algunas, tus estrategias para combatir la polarización y el odio entre los seres humanos. Gracias, Chimamanda.
So what was the last part? Oh, strategies to fight against polarization and hatred. Well, you can refuse to participate, right? There's always a choice to refuse to participate. I think that often we talk about polarization as we should, right? Times are polarized, but I sometimes wonder, what are we doing? So for the people concerned about polarization, how are we using language, and what are we participating in, and what things on social media are you joining? And I think it matters what you're choosing or refusing to participate in. I don't think we can control what other people do, but we can control what we do. Oh, I just wanted to say one last thing about the dress. It's by a wonderful Nigerian designer. I wear mostly Nigerian designers, and this designer is called Sister by Eyoro, E-Y-O-R-O. So if anybody wants to look her up, that's what I wanted to say. But so back to the question of polarization, I think I've always felt that nothing falls from the sky. Right? We made the world as it is, and we can take small steps to remake it. We cannot change, you cannot change the behavior of politicians. You cannot change that there is an increasing number of people who are willing to vote for candidates who are anti-democratic in action. Whether or not they are in their wards is a different thing. You can't change that. But I do wonder how much of our own actions make us complicit. And I'll tell you what I mean. I have friends who complain a lot about polarization. But they're complaining, I'm thinking, well, I did see the thing that you were saying about someone else. It's not that you're not entirely blameless. Right? So for example, there are just certain things I refuse to participate in. There are certain places I will go, and if a certain kind of language is being used, I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to participate. And I think that's one way. But also in general, the response to this growing kind of right-wing, I shouldn't use right-wing, authoritarianism, this kind of growing authoritarianism that's happening in Europe, and of course has happened in the US. And I also want to be clear what I mean. I think that if you have a president who has made changes in a country so that the Supreme Court and so that the justice system is not focused on doing what is right and legally just, but instead focused on pleasing the leader, that is authoritarianism. If you have a government that's telling you that there are certain words you cannot use in government spaces, that is authoritarianism. If you have a country where masked men, without any kind of legal papers, are harassing people and arresting people, often based on just what people look like, that is authoritarianism. And so if you have a government that is harassing universities and a government that is framing intellectual inquiry in very ideological and political terms, that is authoritarianism. So all of those things, I think, happening in America right now are things that we can't, in some ways, those of us who are concerned about polarization, we didn't cause it, but I think we can make personal decisions that perhaps will mean that these things don't get worse. And one of those things is to continue to speak up for what is right and just. I've felt very strongly that this is the time for what I like to call old-fashioned words to come back. Right? Words like good and honor and honesty and justice, and just sort of the real deep meaning. It's time it's time for those words to come back, and to come back in a full way. And by that I don't mean sort of art. So the other thing, polarization. Sometimes that's not my name.
I know.
sometimes I think that the people, so in terms of political tribe, I'm left-leaning. So my political tribe in America would be the American left, but also I am in some ways increasingly a reluctant member of that tribe because of its own problems. But I do sometimes think that the conversation often on both sides has no I think it would be useful if we got back to talking about things with some depth and some facts. And I don't think that happens enough. And so somebody from the right throws something really stupid, and then somebody from the left also responds with equal stupidity. And I just don't see how it helps anyone. So yes, I suppose what I'm saying is I think we should all just read more books. And I'm not even joking, and get off social media. And I think if we read, and I try to do that. So before I get involved in arguments, I kind of want to do my homework. And there's many things I don't feel that I understand fully well, and I don't want to say anything unless I understand it well. So I was talking earlier to somebody about Venezuela and what Trump is doing and how Trump has murdered people on boats. And whether or not those people, apparently those people were carrying drugs, whatever, but carrying drugs is not a reason to just be murdered in that kind of blatant, extrajudicial way. But at the same time, I don't know enough about what's going on in Venezuela and drugs. So now what I want to do is go read about it, because I think before I can have an opinion, I want to know what the hell is going on. It seems to me that it cannot just be about drugs, right? Because I've read that Venezuela is in fact not the country that is sort of conduit to the most amount of drugs to the US. And so you then wonder, well, what is this about? So I suppose my point is that one of the ways that we can reduce polarization is for those of us who think that we are on the right side of history to go read more books. History and novels, some poetry.
We have 5 minutes. So there's another question, please. Allá atrás. Alguien, el micrófono, por favor.
Hi, welcome to Guadalajara. It worries me that feminism becomes a war between genders.
Oh.
I don't know if you've seen news about feminism manifestations here at Mexico, and they usually turn so violent. How can you resume or define feminism in a sense of being respectful to both genders in your own words? I have a lovely father and 3 lovely brothers. Thank you.
Oh, I didn't hear. Can you tell me can I borrow this to fan myself?
No, but can you speak louder, please?
Yeah, I didn't quite
Yeah.
hear the beginning, please.
Okay.
Or maybe in
so-
Spanish, and she, o mejor
No,
en
the English
español.
is fine. It's just that I didn't hear it. The English is
Okay,
fine.
I was saying, it worries me that feminism becomes a war between genders. I don't know if you've seen news about feminism manifestations here at Mexico, and they usually turn so violent. How can you resume or define feminism in a sense of being respectful to both genders on your own words? I have a lovely father and 3 lovely brothers. Thank you.
In my own, so how can I define feminism while being respectful? Look, I believe in being respectful to everyone, but I also worry that women have been socialized to think about respecting men in ways that men have not been socialized to think about respecting women. And so I think that maybe but really, and I don't say that to be provocative or anything, I think it is true. And I think that maybe a more useful way is to say, how can we define feminism in a truthful way, right? And the truth really is that feminism, as I understand it, which is, again, it's a justice movement. And so it's not about hating men. It's never been. They're all of sort of different permutations, and people, but I'm talking about sort of, if you look in the dictionary and what this word means, it has been politicized, all of that has happened, but really fundamentally, it's the belief and it's the acknowledgement of past injustice in every culture in the world, every culture. Every culture in the world has found ways to oppress women because they're women. We're living with that today. It continues today. There is no place in the world where there's equality of men and women. Nowhere. Not even the wonderful Scandinavia where men get to take some time off when they have babies. But women still do all the work anyway. So my personal story, of course, is that I had a wonderful father. I have wonderful brothers. I have dear friends who are men. And many of them, not all of them, by the way, believe in this idea of feminism, but not all. There are people I love who I constantly have to have these conversations with to make them see that there is a problem, right? So my concern really isn't about how to define feminism in a way that doesn't upset men. But I will say that I've never felt that feminism should be a subject that is excluded from men. I think, for example, that young boys are having a very hard time today. I think that part of the reason that we read about the manosphere and young men being drawn to sort of increasingly extreme movements is really that there's something missing. And I think that thing that is missing is good male role models. So I feel strongly that the good men need to stand up more. So people like my father, who's no longer here, but who was just a wonderful, my father was a gentleman. He was also a gentleman, but he was also quite strong. And, in many ways, had the attributes of masculinity. My father felt that it was his role to protect. I think he was a courageous man in a very quiet way. But there was no aggression and there was no violence. So I think that there are ways to redefine and maybe redirect what we call masculinity. I don't think there's any excuse for violence and aggression. I don't think that is masculinity. I think that comes from a certain kind of fragility that people think is strength, but isn't. I mean, if you need to beat people up and if you need to scare people to feel better about yourself, then something's really wrong with you, I think. And so, yes, so I suppose to answer your question, I don't want to define it in a way that makes men feel better, but I do think that men are part of the conversation. And increasingly, I think about, and I've been reading about young men, because we cannot talk about male violence against women and girls, which is an epidemic everywhere in the world. I mean, the women are being murdered, and the statistics are terrible. Mexico is terrible. Right? And we should talk about that more. I sometimes think that there is something globally where we almost think it will happen anyway, so what's the point? And so we kind of talk about it, but there isn't a kind of collective sort of howling, enraged noise about male violence against women. And women are dying. And it is male violence, that is the problem. The problem is male violence. How are we talking about that? I think that because the problem is male violence, we cannot focus only on the victims. We have to focus on the perpetrators. We have to really look into where does it change for boys? What happens? How does that happen? What is it about? And to do that, we need men. We need the few good men to talk to other men and create more good men.
Thank you. So we can answer 2 more questions, please. So, here.
Chimamanda, para mí es un honor estar aquí contigo y quisiera preguntarte de la mano con lo que ya mencionaste hace un momento y una frase que tú decías muy poderosa, que el tema del feminismo es que dejemos de hablar de él porque todos seamos iguales. ¿Qué condiciones ves mejores desde que tuviste ese famoso TED Talk de todos debemos ser feministas, ahora en el 2025? ¿Cuál es tu mensaje de esperanza que crees que haya mejorado? Ya nos dijiste hacia dónde tendríamos que ir, pero ¿cómo ves estos cambios de cara a la joven Chimamanda, ahora una mujer que es pues mucho más conocedora del mundo y que ha viajado más?
Yeah, well, the difference between young Chimamanda and old Chimamanda is that I now have hot flashes, which is what's happening now. And I want to keep my answers short so that we can get to 2 more questions. Her question, that there was a guy who had his hand up. So I'll keep it short. I would have said much more, but really, old Chimamanda is that I'm 48 years old. I'm in perimenopause. I want us to talk more about what happens to women's bodies. And it is very uncomfortable for me to sit here. I want to be very present for all of you, but I am sweating and I'm hot. And the heat comes from inside my body, and it's because my estrogen is gone. Okay. So the other question, also it affects your memory. So I don't remember a damn thing. So now, usually when I read books, I don't underline because, I just had a fantastic brain. I remembered everything. Now, just because I forget every damn thing, I'm making notes and underlining. But that talk, when I gave that talk, actually I wouldn't really change very much, honestly. I think, if anything, things have changed a bit, and I think things have changed in the sense that there is more of a conversation. I think that, and I feel quite pleased that that TED Talk was part of making feminism a word that people who probably would not have heard it did, right? And also I thank Beyonce, because I think she also made a lot of people, by using my words, suddenly want to know what feminism was. I think there's more of a conversation. I think that there's a bit more of an acknowledgement of why it's important, but there's still a long way to go. Thank you. Water doesn't help, though. I think many women here know exactly what I'm talking about. Sometimes as early as 38. It's messed up. And then you have a health establishment globally that doesn't pay attention to women's bodies. So men get Viagra. It's so difficult. I was talking to a woman in New York, even in New York City, a very privileged woman. It was so difficult for her to get an appointment to see a menopause specialist. So anyway, yes. If I had to add, I tell you what I would add. If I had to do that talk again, I would add how important it is to talk about women's bodies and what women's bodies go through, because it is so important. And I would make different arguments for it. I would make what I think is the best argument, which is that women matter because they're human beings. But I could also make an economic argument, because we now live in a world where capitalism has so made us mad that everything has to be economically justified. So the argument I would make is that the productivity of women would increase if you take care of their health. So, so companies will make more money if we make sure that women's perimenopause and menopause is sorted out. That's a good argument, right, for some people. I would add that. The other thing I think I would add to that talk would be about violence. I don't think that I was as aware and as educated on the subject of male violence against women when I gave that talk. I think I probably would say more about it. I was fortunate to have a very sheltered upbringing, and it took a while to realize how much of an epidemic the killing of women is all over the world. I think I would probably say something about that. And I think I would also add that young boys are having a hard time, and that we need to save them. Yeah. Okay.
Solo tenemos tiempo para una última pregunta, por favor, de este lado.
Hola. Bueno, pues en México, hace 3 años, acaban de reconocer a la comunidad afrodescendiente. Y bueno, estamos trabajando para visibilizar la presencia de las mujeres afromexicanas en este país. Chimamanda, me gustaría que le mandaras un mensaje a las niñas, a las infancias afrodescendientes, para que sigan luchando por la equidad y la justicia en este país, por visibilizar la importancia en la historia de México y, bueno, de la cultura de México y del mundo. Muchas gracias, Chimamanda. En México te amamos.
Thank you. We saved the best question for last. I actually remember reading about that. And what's the area called again? I remember reading about that some time ago. And again, I did not even know. Yes. I didn't know about Black Mexicans. And so I was delighted. I was like, yes, Well, what needs to happen is that we need to take over the whole of Mexico. But anyway, that was a joke. Don't put it on social media, please. I think the message it's really to say, those of us who are, actually every human being on earth came from Africa, but those of us who more recently are descendants of Africans. I think it's really important to know that where you find yourself now in the world, it's really important not to apologize for taking up space there. It's yours, right? And I'm sad that it took this long to get a recognition, and I think this is also happening in some of the Spanish-speaking countries where the Afro-descendants of those countries are often marginalized. But that's not a reason. It's important to remember that the marginalization is not it's the problem of the people who are marginalizing, not your problem, right? There's nothing about being a descendant of Africa that makes you less worthy, nothing. If anything, it makes you just a little bit more beautiful, I think. And so I want to send all my love, and I have to come. The next time I come to Mexico, I'm going to come visit. Sorry.
Desafortunadamente tenemos que terminar, pero Chimamanda estará firmando libros en el macromódulo de firmas para quienes estén ahí y alcancen pulsera. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Chimamanda, for this wonderful and powerful speech. Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming. Thank you very much.